Hello, everyone. I'm here with Jim Copple and Colleen Copple for a special episode of Plug into Devin. And we want to talk about something really difficult today, and I hope you'll bear with us. But Colleen and Jim have been working for more than a decade on community policing issues, including a report on 21st century policing for President Obama in 2015, and a report apropos of everything right now in 2019 on policing and the use of deadly force by police in Minneapolis just last year. So Jim and Colleen are real experts on some of the issues we're facing today. You don't want to miss this episode. Jim, Colleen, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
We really appreciate you taking the time. You know, Utah's in a difficult situation as we deal with the pain of both the death of Nathan Lyday in Ogden, 24-year-old police officer killed in the line of duty. At the same time, we wrestle with the implications of misuse of force in the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, where you've done some work. Colleen, maybe we can just start with you quickly. How do you weigh these two issues?
Well, they're sort of two ends of the same picture. With President Obama's task force, we focused on use of force at one end, trust and legitimacy, and at the other end, officer safety and wellness. You can't deal with the issue without recognizing our goal is to protect everyone in this situation. And so officer safety and is primary, and we recognize that domestic violence situations are probably the most dangerous situations that police officers walk into at any given time.
Jim, how do you think about, after doing this report in Minneapolis, do you think implementation of your report's recommendations, which really had not been implemented yet because of the timing of COVID and the timing of the report, it's just so recent, could this situation have been prevented by implementation of those ideas?
Yeah, in fact, the report was designed to address the kind of situations the officers found themselves in, and also the community, is reduction of force, use of force, how we use force, and training is a critical component of that. The report was released in February, COVID happened in March, and that's been the focus. But the Attorney General, as well as the Department of Public Safety Commissioner for the state, have made a commitment to really drive the implementation of the recommendations. And I think improved training, review of policies and procedures, recruitment issues are all found in the report. There are over 800,000 law enforcement officers in the country and 18,000 law enforcement agencies. And so you will have bad apples. And this clearly, the evidence is demonstrating we had some police that just were not following policies and procedures and committed to what is a major principle of the report on the sanctity of life, that everybody needs to be involved in protecting life in these situations.
It is interesting. One of the things in your report was a recommendation that police officers immediately render aid to gunshot victims, even if they themselves, the cops, were the ones to shoot the victim. And I think that is kind of the human response, but it wasn't what cops were always doing. Tell us a little bit about that. Colleen, I don't know, can you address that?
Sure. Yeah, it grew initially out of officers needing to protect themselves being shot. So they were beginning to be provided with the medical tools you need to stop the bleed. Sort of stop the bleed is a whole separate movement. But it's carried into recognizing, especially after situations like Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old shot with a fake gun on a playground, they let him bleed out. They could have saved his life. And so this is an emerging principle that officers are now carrying medic kits so that they can stop the bleed, do anything they need to be able to help resuscitate if they have the capacity to do that and it's safe enough for them to do that. So that's an important principle. And I would say one of the most important things we learned from the hearings we held in Minnesota, it was a statewide task force, was a report from Camden, New Jersey. Camden was the murder capital of the world or the country in 2008. It's not that big of a city, 90,000 people. But they, over the last several years, have totally changed their policing priorities to do no harm. That's the first priority, is to do no harm. That means to protect officers' lives as well as the lives of the people that they serve. So sanctity of life, as Jim said. The second thing that they did was they mandated a duty to intervene. As a police officer, if my partner or other officer I see using excessive force, then I'm required ethically and morally and by my department's policy to intervene in the situation. Those other 3 officers should have intervened in that situation instead of contributing to it. That's why they're culpable, because they didn't stop the situation. So there are also some new emerging tactics that they use. And the reason it's important is they went from 65 complaints of use of force to 1 annually in Camden, New Jersey, one of the toughest cities in the country. So we know that with good policy and better tactics, so they started doing things like slow down, back up, take cover, don't force the situation. They define it as officer-created jeopardy, where the officers, by their behavior, their intensity, they're getting too close, instead of looking for alternatives to intervene in a way that protects and saves lives. Anyway, they've totally changed the results in their community and the level of trust that community has in them without putting officers' lives in more danger. So we know it's possible, but that takes real commitment, and it's a big change in culture. And so we know Chief Arredondo, the chief of the Minneapolis department. He was on the task force. He's a man committed to these reforms. He has championed them. He's driven the training. I think one of the issues that we saw here is this officer had 18 similar complaints against him for excessive force. That's a supervision issue. And that's an internal police practice issue that needs to be addressed. So there are still some gaps, but there are definitely solutions out there.
Jim, the rioting going on, especially in Minneapolis, but to some extent, peaceful protests have turned violent around the country now. That seems to be an outcry for justice for George Floyd. Based on your interaction with the key people involved in this case before it happened, your experience with them and their process, will George Floyd receive the justice that these people are seeking?
Oh, I believe he will. I think the speed with which this investigation is taking place, the commitment on the part of the governor, the district attorney, and the attorney general, and the civil rights division within the state of Minnesota, I think that's going to be a key piece. I think justice will be achieved. And I think, unfortunately, the rioting, while the catalyst for the rioting has been the George Floyd killing, it is a lot of other complex things boiling over of economic oppression, social oppression in a neighborhood or community that has seen economic disparity, as well as just the complexity of the COVID-19 quarantine and its impact on the African-American community. This was a tinderbox ready to be ignited, and George Floyd was that, and I think there will be justice achieved through this.
Devin, if I could just add to that, I think because this situation was so obvious that it was not necessary to have used that level of force. Proportionality is the other key word here. California just passed a new law redefining use of force, upgrading sort of the standard that it's imminent danger, that your life, that person is an imminent danger to someone else's life or the officer's life. That means they've drawn a weapon, they're going to kill somebody. That's when that level of use of force is acceptable. This was not that situation. So anyway, I think it's important that we look at the whole context, and part of what I think I really learned from this whole experience of listening to communities, families who had lost loved ones to police deadly force encounters, is just how gut-wrenching it is, and how this is really a historic trauma issue for African American communities, Latinos, Native Americans. Those communities have gone through hundreds and hundreds of these experiences. This one happened to be such a flashpoint because it was so obvious. We didn't have to wait for body cameras to be released in 3 weeks or 60 days or for a big long grand jury. We didn't have to wait for that. It's not cut and dry, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And that's what triggered, I think, the level of anger. So they weren't happy just that the officers were fired. They expected they should have been arrested for murder because that's what they saw them doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's complicated. Yeah.
Jim, Colleen, we've got to wrap this up today, but will you come back and talk to me more about this? Will you continue this discussion?
We'd love to.
I appreciate that. Before we go, Colleen, maybe you could just take quick 30 seconds on behalf of you and Jim and tell people how they can learn more about your work at Strategic Applications International.
Sure. You can go to sai-dc.com as a website to check it out. You can search the Minnesota Department of Public Safety has the report that was issued with the recommendations and action steps on deadly use of force. And you can search the Task Force on 21st Century Policing for the national recommendations on how to reduce use of force.
Fantastic. Well, again, Jim, Colleen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And we wish you every success in your work to reduce these tensions and save lives around the world, really, as you work to reduce these tensions. So thank you.
Thank you, Devin.
All righty. Let's be bold together.
I'm Devin Thorpe. For the last 8 years, I've been working full-time to eradicate extreme poverty, improve global health, and fight climate change. I've concluded that the best way for me to continue my work is to run for Congress to represent the people of Utah's 3rd District. In Utah, we have common shared values. Those things unite us. I believe passionately in our ability to come together, and I believe that working together, we can solve Utah's problems. I'm Devin Thorpe. I'm a Democrat. I'm running to represent the people of Utah's 3rd District.
I'm Devin Thorpe, a candidate for Congress, and I approve this message.